Good morning, everyone, and welcome to PJR's webinar on IATF 16949. Today's presentation is third in a series, and the fourth part will conclude our series, and that will be conducted on August 2nd. We welcome you here today and want to let you know that all participants have been muted to ensure sound quality. At the end of today's presentation, I will open the floor up to any questions that you may have on today's content or anything that we've covered thus far. Please type any questions that you have into the question feature of the GoToWebinar. Copies of the slides, as well as a recording of today's presentation, will be available for download at our website, www.pjr.com. It's also here where you can check out previous webinars that have already been completed, as well as sign yourself up for other future free webinars. So let's pick up where we left off. Section 811, Operational Planning and Control Supplemental. So supplemental to the requirements of ISO 9001-2015. We're clarifying here that the resources needed to achieve conformity impact all aspects of the development process, not just the manufacturing process. And when planning for product realization, the organization needs to ensure their planning covers the following topics: customer product requirements and technical specifications, logistics requirements, manufacturing feasibility, project planning. We'll get into that more when we discuss design, and acceptance criteria. Moving on to 812, confidentiality. This is simply a clarification. Confidentiality includes related product information instead of using the word and. No change in intent here. 8211, customer communication supplemental. So this is a supplement to the 9001-2015 requirements. There's an addition of a requirement: the communication language, whether it's written or verbal, must be agreed with the customer. And the organization needs to ensure that it has the ability to communicate necessary information, including data in the customer specified computer language and format. This may be CAD, this may be EDI, ASN, etc. (8221), a supplement to 9001-2015, determining the requirements for products and services. Notes 2 and 3 in TS 16949 have been elevated into requirements. This suggests that the organization needs to have knowledge regarding recycling, environmental impact, and product and manufacturing process characteristics. This knowledge would need to be systematically reviewed and used when determining the requirements for the products and services to be offered to customers. (82311), review of the requirements for products and services supplemental. A strengthening of a requirement here. IATF requires the organization to retain a documented customer authorization for waivers of formal reviews for products and services. So if you're going to do that, you need a documented waiver from your customer. Clarification in 82312, customer designated special characteristics. This section changed the action from demonstrate conformity to conform and clarifies that it refers to approval documentation rather than just documentation. Again, no change in intent here. (82313), organization manufacturing feasibility. Enhancement of some requirements here. A multidisciplinary approach to analyze feasibility considering all engineering and capacity requirements. This analysis must be done for any new manufacturing or product technology, and as well as for any changes. And the organization should validate their ability to make product meeting specifications at the required rate, and make sure that they're meeting any customer-specific requirements. Okay, moving into section 8.3, design. This was formerly in 7.3 in TS 16949. Okay, in 8.3.1.1, a note has been elevated to a requirement, and most importantly, there's been an added requirement for the documentation of the design and development process. So the process itself that you follow has to be documented in some way, a procedure, a flow chart, something. We always have to remember that in the automotive standard, IATF 16949, the concept of design and development not only includes product design and development, but also process design and development. 8321, design and development planning supplemental, so some additional requirements above and beyond ISO 9001, 2015. So clarification when the multidisciplinary approach is to be used and who should be involved. The organization's design personnel, manufacturing, engineering, quality, production, purchasing, potentially suppliers involved in the process, maintenance, etc. All stakeholders within the organization, in other words, and as appropriate, getting the supply chain involved. Where might you need to use the multidisciplinary approach? During design and development planning. And there's a note that clarifies, again, who must be involved. More on when that multidisciplinary approach should be used. Manufacturing process design activities, considering, for example, the use of alternative designs in manufacturing processes, development of DFEMAs, process flows, control plans, and work instructions. 8322, not a change in intent here. A note has been added as an example of what a product design skill set may be. Application of digitized, mathematically based data is the example given. No change in intent. 8323, this is a significant change. Luckily, it only impacts those organizations developing products with embedded software. So if an organization is responsible for the development of a product that has some type of embedded software, there needs to be some type of capability self-assessment done by the organization. They have to have an appropriate assessment methodology to assess their software development process. And the software development process needs to be included in the scope of the internal audit program. Obviously, if you're doing a full system audit, you should expect to hit this. However, the internal auditor needs to be able to understand and assess the effectiveness of the software capability assessment methodology that's chosen by the organization. So this implies a special skill set for the internal auditor. And it may be that you have one internal auditor that is specifically assigned to the audit of this section. Most of your internal auditors will not have this skill set. And when we audit internal auditor competency, this is something we're going to be looking at. (8.331) is product design input. The organization needs to identify, document, and review product design input requirements as part of the contract review process. Inputs to the product design process might include product specifications, traceability and packaging requirements, consideration of design alternatives, risk assessment, statutory regulatory requirements, embedded software requirements, health, safety, and environmental considerations as a tie back to 8221. (8332) goes through manufacturing process design input requirements. Again, the organization has to identify, document, and review manufacturing process design input requirements. And these can include product design output data, including special characteristics, productivity targets, process capability targets, timing and cost targets, manufacturing technology alternatives, experience from previous developments, product handling and ergonomic requirements, etc. The note regarding error-proofing methods is now a requirement. The manufacturing process design shall include the use of error-proofing methods to a degree appropriate to the magnitude of the problem and commensurate with the risk encountered. (8333) special characteristics. The organization has to use a multidisciplinary approach again to establish, document, and implement its processes to identify special characteristics. So to be clear, the expectation is that the organization is documenting its process to identify special characteristics. Special characteristics need to be marked on all applicable quality planning documents. Monitoring strategies should focus on reducing variation. The organization should consider the use of customer-specific requirements for approvals and the use of certain definitions and symbols. And if a symbol conversion table needs to be submitted to the customer, it shall be done. (8341) relates to monitoring. Measurements apply at specific stages of the design and development process for both products and services, and reporting on those processes must occur at stages required by the customer. An example of this could be the periodic update of customer APQ schedule milestone dates, gate reviews, and open issues lists related to development activities. (8342) design and development validation. Design and development needs to be performed in accordance with customer requirements, including any applicable industry and government agency issued regulatory standards. The timing of validation activities needs to align with customer specific requirements. And when agreed with the customer, this shall include an evaluation of the interaction of the organization's product, including any embedded software within the system of the final customer's product. So if you're making a component or a subassembly, the validation may have to take place within the system or testing the interface with the customer's final product. (8343), a prototype program. When it's required by the customer, the organization has to have a prototype program and its own control plan, using the same suppliers, tooling, and manufacturing processes that will be used in the organization. Whenever activities are outsourced, the organization needs to include the type and extent of control and the scope of its QMS. Remember, we talked about that in section 4. 8344, product approval process. The organization needs to establish, implement, and maintain a product and manufacturing approval process that conforms with customer-specific requirements. In many cases, for example, this may be PPAP. The organization has to maintain documented approval before shipment. If any part of this process is outsourced, as explained by the third bullet, the part approval process for externally provided products and services needs to be performed prior to final product submission to the customer. Of course, records shall be maintained. 8351 talks about design and development outputs. Outputs need to be expressed in a way that they can be verified and validated against product design input requirements. A list of what is included product design output would be your design FEMA, product special characteristics, results of design error proofing, product design review results, service part requirements, packaging and labeling requirements for shipment, etc. (8352) talks about manufacturing process design output. Manufacturing process design input needs to be documented in a way that enables verification against manufacturing process design input requirements. Manufacturing process design output may include specs and drawings, special characteristics, tooling and equipment, layout, flow charts, capacity analysis, the manufacturing FEMA, control plans, work instructions, etc. 8361, design and development changes supplemental. The organization is required to evaluate all design changes after initial approval of the product, including those proposed by the organization or its suppliers for fit, form, and function, performance, or durability. And any changes need to be validated against customer requirements. If required by the customer, the organization needs to obtain approval for changes prior to implementing these into production. And again, a requirement specific to embedded software, the organization has to document the revision level of software and hardware as part of the change record. Okay, moving into purchasing, which is now in section 8.4. 8411, general supplemental. The requirements of 8.4 apply to subassembly, sequencing, sorting, rework, and calibration services. Many people think it just relates to purchased raw materials and products and component parts. And it's now very clear that this is expanded to include related services supporting the manufacturing process. (8412) talks about the supplier selection process. There's a requirement here that the organization has to have a documented supplier selection process. We would be looking for a procedure, a work instruction, a flow chart. This process needs to call out an assessment of the selected supplier's risk, quality and delivery performance, an evaluation of their quality management system, multidisciplinary decision-making, and assessment of software development capabilities if they're providing such a product. Other selection criteria that needs to be included should be considered, I'm sorry, to be very clear. The volume of the supplier's automotive business, their financial stability, adequacy of available resources, manufacturing capabilities, their change management process, their business continuity planning, their logistics and customer service. So again, you need to have a documented supplier selection process. 8412 lists some things that this process must include and some things it should include. 8413 talks about directed by, customer directed sources. A reiteration here that the organization is responsible for customer directed sources, even for customer directed by suppliers. All requirements of IATF always apply in this situation, except requirements related to the selection of the supplier itself. So you can't wash your hands of any issues just because you're you're in a directed by situation. (8421) talks about the type and extent of control, and it's a supplement to ISO 9001:2015. Again, the organization has to have a documented process to identify outsourced processes and select the types and extent of controls that are used to verify the conformity of the externally provided products and services. The process that's documented should include the criteria and actions to escalate or reduce the types and extent of controls and development activities based on supplier performance and assessment of the product, material, or service risks. This documented process could be combined with the one called out in 8412. And again, here we have a implication of a constant monitoring of performance and assessment of risk based on the established criteria, triggering actions to escalate, increase, or reduce the types of and extent of control based on the supplier's performance. So again, implication of a very dynamic system. Ongoing monitoring of suppliers of both products and services. And again, as all organizations have a finite amount of resources to go around, adjusting the level of control applied to a supplier based on their performance. 8422, statutory and regulatory requirements. The organization has to document a process to ensure that purchased products, processes, and services conform to current applicable statutory regulatory requirements in the country of receipt, shipment, and the customer identified country of destination if provided. And if your customer defines special controls for certain products with statutory regulatory requirements, you as the organization have to ensure that you are implementing and maintaining these and flowing them down to suppliers as needed. So again, here, a documented process for how you're going to get your arms around the applicable statutory regulatory requirements, how you're going to make sure they're intrinsic and ingrained in your system and flow them down to affected suppliers as needed. (8423), supplier quality management system development. I find this to be an interesting change, as ISO TS 16949 required all suppliers to be ISO 9001:2008 certified at minimum by an accredited CB, by a certification body accredited by an accreditation body that was an IAF MLA signatory. This new revised requirement provides a progressive approach that goes from compliance to ISO 9001 through second party audits, all the way through certification to IATF 16949 through third party audits and certification. 84231, automotive product related software or automotive products with embedded software. So we talked about the design requirements for organizations dealing with product with embedded software. Now it talks about what needs to be flowed down to your supplier. The organization shall require the supplier to retain documented information of a software development capability self-assessment. So just like an organization may have to do that, if this is outsourced to suppliers, or suppliers have to do that capability self-assessment as well. 8424, again, a requirement for a documented process, which includes criteria to evaluate supplier performance in order to ensure the conformity of externally provided products, processes, and services. The following indicators need to be monitored: delivered product conformity to requirements. Are you getting conforming product? Customer disruptions at the receiving plant, including error holds and stop shipments. Delivery schedule performance, essentially on-time delivery, and instances of premium freight. Organizations may also want to consider monitoring the following: special status customer notifications, dealer returns, warranty, field actions, or recalls. So here again, what I think a really important change is this documented process for supplier monitoring, which could be a standalone documented process or included as a supplement to the supplier selection process. 84241 talks about second-party audits. The requirement here is very clear. You need to be using second-party audits in your supplier management strategy. And they can be used for supplier risk assessment, ongoing supplier monitoring as part of 8424, supplier QMS development as part of 8423A, product audits and process audits. Using a risk-based approach, the organization needs to determine and document the criteria for the need, type, frequency, and scope of second-party audits. Obviously, it's expensive to conduct a second-party audit. Where are you going to get the most bang for your buck? The organization has to retain records of second-party audit reports. And if you're doing a second-party audit as part of supplier QMS development, then the approach shall be consistent with the automotive process approach to auditing. 8425 talks about supplier development. Here there's an emphasis on performance-based supplier development activities. So 8424 talks about the supplier monitoring that you're going to be doing. 8425 talks about what do you do with those monitoring results? Or the results of second-party audit findings, third-party quality management system certification status, and risk analysis. There's a thought that there would be consideration to both short-term and long-term efforts in your supplier development process. Short-term efforts would generally focus on supplier products. Long-term efforts would focus on the development of the supplier's QMS and manufacturing processes as a whole. And you should consider activities such as training to enhance the relationship between the suppliers and the organization to further reduce risk. (8431) information for external providers. Organization is required to provide key information to its supply chain. There has to be flow down. And this key information includes all applicable statutory and regulatory requirements and special product and process characteristics. Okay, moving away from supplier development activities into the control plan, which is covered in 8511. Here we see an alignment of customer-specific requirements into the IATF 16949 standard. Not a change, but again, want to reemphasize that control plans need to exist at the system, subsystem, component, and material level for the relevant manufacturing site and for all product supplied, including bulk materials as well as parts. Family control plans are acceptable. Organizations should use these with caution, however. A few more words about the control plans that I want to talk about. And this comes directly from the standard. It isn't necessarily documented clearly on this slide. The following shall be included in the control plan: controls used for manufacturing process control, including verification of job set-offs, first off, last off validation, control over special characteristics, any customer required information. This section 8511 also talks about when the organization should review control plans, which would include when any changes occur to the product manufacturing process, measurement logistics, your supply base, after a customer complaint and implementation of a corrective action. Both the control plan and FEMA should be updated to take credit for that change. 8512 talks about standardized work instructions. The organization needs to be sure that they are addressing any language needs by the personnel who will be following them. They need to be legible and accessible at the designated work area, and they need to include information about worker safety. 8513 talks about verification of job setups. Clarification of when job setups verification needs to occur: initial run of a job, material changeover, or a job change. A requirement that documented information needs to be retained for setup personnel. Statistical methods of verification: first off, last off, part validation, and retention of records of process and product approval following setup and first off, last off part validations. (8514), this is a new requirement here: verification after shutdown. The organization has to define and implement the necessary actions to ensure product compliance with requirements after a planned or unplanned production shutdown. These should be anticipated in the PFEMA and outlined in the control plans and maintenance instructions. A multidisciplinary approach should be used to determine what these actions are. (8515) outlines the process for a system for total productive maintenance. We had requirements related to preventive and predictive maintenance in TS 16949. There is now a requirement to document a TPM system, and it shall include the following: identification of the equipment, not a big change, availability of replacement parts, provision of resources for maintenance, packaging and preservation requirements for equipment, tool, and gauging, incorporation of any customer-specific requirements for this documented process, maintenance objectives, which may include OEE, mean time between failure, mean time to repair, regular review of the maintenance plan and objectives, use of preventive maintenance and predictive maintenance, and periodic overhaul of equipment. again, a requirement here that I want to make sure everybody's understanding to document the TPM system. 8516 does not have a requirement to document a system for production tooling and manufacturing. However, the organization has to provide resources for tool engaged design, fabrication, and verification activities. There needs to be a system for production tooling management that covers maintenance and repair, storage and recovery, setup, tool change programs if the tools are perishable, tool design modification documentation, tool identification. Any customer-owned tools and equipment need to be permanently marked in a visible location so that the ownership and application of each item can be determined. '8517 production scheduling. Again, not much new here. Production needs to be scheduled in order to meet customer orders and demands using just-in-time as an example, supported by an information-driven system that permits access to production information at key stages. '8521 and a supplement to the requirements in ISO 9001:2015. There's a strengthening here of the requirements for traceability to support industry lessons learned related to field issues. Requirement of clear start and stop points for product received by the customer to align with the definition of traceability in 9000:2015. '8541 is preservation supplemental. There's first a clarification that preservation includes identification, handling, contamination control, packaging, storage, and protection. This section expands preservation in two ways: activities which are considered preservation controls and locations where preservation controls apply. So these may be extended to suppliers. Organizations have to use inventory management systems such as FIFO. Any obsolete product is controlled in a manner similar to non-conforming product. And organizations have to comply with preservation, packaging, shipping, and labeling requirements as provided by their customers. '8551, feedback of information from service. The organization has to ensure that a process for communication of information on service concerns to manufacturing, materials, logistics, engineering, and design is established, implemented, and maintained. Interestingly, here there's no requirement for a documented process for this. There is a new note, note 2, clarifies that service concerns shall include the results of field failure test analysis where applicable, to ensure that the organization is aware of nonconformities that occur outside of the organization. '8552, service agreements with the customer. In those instances where there is a service agreement with a customer, the organization shall verify that relevant service centers comply with applicable requirements. The effectiveness of any special purpose tools or measuring equipment is verified, and that service personnel are trained appropriately. (8561) control of changes. There needs to be a documented process to control and react to changes that impact product realization. Changes may result from the organization itself, their customers, or their suppliers. The organization has to define the verification and validation activities needed to ensure compliance with customer requirements, validate changes before implementation, conduct the appropriate risk analysis, and retain records of verification and validation. This may include a production trial run for verification of changes. Customer-specific requirements shall be followed, including notifying the customer of any planned product realization changes, obtaining documented approval, and completing additional verification or identification requirements such as production trial run and new product validation. 85611, I think, is one of the most significant changes in the standard itself. A new requirement for the organization to identify, document, and maintain a list of process controls, including inspection, measuring, test, and error proofing. That includes the primary process control and approved backup or alternate method. So essentially what this means is any activity on your control plan, any inspection, measurement, test, or error proofing device, you need to include your primary process control as well as an approved backup method. It would make sense to update these and list them on your control plan. An example of your primary control may be an automated nut driver, and an approved backup method may be a manual torque wrench. Before shipping product that was inspected or tested using this alternative method, the organization shall obtain approval from the customer. Standardized work instructions need to be available for these alternative methods. The organization needs to control the use of these alternate process control methods. This can be done through daily quality-focused audits, like a layered process audit, or through communication and team meetings. Restart activities need to be controlled and documented to ensure that all features of the error-proofing device or process have been effectively reinstated. The organization also needs to maintain traceability for all product produced while the alternate process control devices or processes are being used. So again, I think this is one of the most significant changes in the standard. Having a documented process for identifying what inspections, measurements, tests, or error-proofing methods need an alternate backup method. Making sure that you have updated your control plan to reflect these methods. You're controlling the use of these methods through layered process audits, maybe shift crossover meetings. You're notifying the customer as appropriate. You're maintaining traceability on any product shipped using these alternate methods. I was asked in a prior webinar what I think the biggest change in the standard is. I think this is one of them. Okay, for today, we are going to stop with section 861, and the final part of the webinar will conclude with the rest of section 8 and 86 and 87, and then move into sections 9 and 10. So we'll now open the floor up to any questions that you may have. and I'll try to answer as many of these as possible in the 15 or so minutes that we have remaining. Looks like we have a lot of questions coming in. Bear with me. Somebody's asking for a more basic review, a more in-depth review of the requirements for somebody who's really a beginner with some of the automotive quality standards. Brandy, I would recommend you look at courses offered by the AIAG, although a Google search might reveal other more cost-effective providers. Great question about 8423. Is that stating that any and all of our suppliers have to achieve certification? No, Chris. In fact, this requirement is more liberal than TS 16949, and it suggests a progressive approach. Compliance through second-party audits, certification to ISO 9001, certification to ISO 9001 with compliance to automotive requirements, certification ISO 9001 in compliance to IATF 16949 through second party audits, all the way through certification to IATF 16949. So again, a risk-based approach depending on the type of supplier and what service or product they're providing you. But it is possible that some of your suppliers would be controlled by you through second-party audits conducted by second-party auditors meeting the second-party auditor requirements in the standard. At the time of transition, all of your suppliers have to be 9001 certified at minimum, or you need to be doing second-party audits of them. Your second-party audits need to use the automotive process approach and be conducted by auditors that meet the appropriate requirements. And if those second-party audits are done appropriately by appropriately competent auditors, you should not have a finding. But if you have suppliers that aren't certified to 9001 by an accredited third party and you have not done a second-party audit of them, Chris, you are at risk for a nonconformity. Someone's asking about 85611. We're an injection molder, primarily shoot and ship. This requirement applies for you, Mr. Taylor. Perhaps if you've implemented some error proofing, you would have some manual checks on some of your parts. That's really the only thing that I can think of without knowing more about your process. But 85611 is something that would apply to you. Wait a few more minutes to see if any other questions come in. While we wait for more questions to come in, let me take this opportunity to remind you that our website, www.pjr.com, has information on future webinars as well as how to access previously recorded webinars. And as always, a copy of today's slides and a digital recording of today's presentation will be made available within 24 to 48 hours after the conclusion of today's presentation. One of the themes that I think came out of today's presentation as we went through some of the requirements in 8 are requirements for a documented process. A documented process may or may not be a procedure. Procedure is one way of meeting it. Could be a flow chart, use of a computer program, but lots of requirements you need to be watching for documented processes. Also in many areas where it was never required before. Design, purchasing related requirements in 8.4 are 2 examples. That new requirement in 85611 is the 3rd example. Many more. Wait just one more minute to see if we get any other questions. Okay, folks, appreciate your time today. Thank you for dialing in, and we look forward to speaking with you on August 2nd for the conclusion of this 4-part series in IATF 16949.